Hey everyone, my name's Jad, and I read The Dream of a Ridiculous Man by Fyodor Dostoevsky so that you don't have to. In this video, I'll start off by hitting the 5 main points: the who, what, where, when, and why. And to answer that very quick first question, the ridiculous man, this first idea of who this story is about, there is no answer. I mean, we don't really know who this guy is, so I'm just going to call him the ridiculous man, RM. What is this story about? I have written down that it's, or if we wanted to say what is this story, I'd say it's a short story. And the genre would be considered short story style and genre. I would venture to say, if we're looking at general terms of classification, it's a spiritual story. Of course, that is sort of my opinion. It's a story about nihilism, or nihilism, as you may call it. And I would limit it to those two right now because if we wanted to get into more detail about style or artistic expression, we could also say that it's a early surreal story. It has exhibits some aspects of surrealism. But to move on and to take this story to the next level, we want to say, where is this story based? And it's in St. Petersburg. Of course, where else would it be? Some of the best stories of Dostoevsky, if we're thinking about crime and punishment, take place in an urban, a metropolitan situation, usually walking the streets, encountering people of the metropolis or people of these sort of modern industrialized cities or capital cities. St. Petersburg is a great and such an evocative city to Dostoevsky's writing. Really goes hand in hand. When is this story set? I'll venture that it's the mid-19th century. Because why not? I think a lot of Dostoevsky's stories are based in this mid-19th century. This one doesn't necessarily capture the political climate in much detail. It doesn't really capture a lot of other aspects of culture other than the fact that there seems to be this sense of poverty on the streets, a sense of sort of frugality. Talks about a little bit the lieutenant or the captain that's living in the room next to him in the hotel style living quarters, who seems to be hard up on cash, can't really afford decent living. Neither can this character, this ridiculous man. Just that kind of actually hit back on this ridiculous man. We don't really know the age of this gentleman, but we can assume that he's probably, older than 20. I wouldn't say that he's middle-aged. I wouldn't say that he's hit that 40 or 50 mark. He's probably still considered a young man. Again, young in the broadest sense, young being not middle-aged. And then why? In this case, I'll describe the why of the story as sort of a psychological story that sort of uncovers what this young man might be feeling faced with ideas of existentialism, of the meaninglessness of things, of the world. And in this case, I'm using existentialism because it's the word that we use today. I'll also use nihilism or nihilism because that would have been more appropriate during that time if we're thinking about Nietzsche, or if we're thinking about loss of religious meaning, loss of purpose of life. I'll also use a couple of other words here. It's a story about suicide, related to nihilism in this case, or nihilism. It's about indifference to the world. indifference to oneself, and then I'll also say apathy. Feeling apathetic about the world. So those are the main questions, the main ideas of the story. The first, who, what, where, when, why. And in more detail, I'll just read a few of the notes that I have, and I might write down some more notes as well onto this blackboard about the story. This is more of a review than it is a critical analysis, but I do hit on a couple of points, for example, for further reading, what you might want to enjoy, what you might want to dive more deeply into. Let's say if you're reading this for a college class, or if you're reading this in high school, or if you're just reading this out of the curiosity of Dostoevsky, if you're also thinking about Nietzsche, if you're thinking about Bakhtin, if you're thinking about 19th century philosophy, Stoicism, etc., etc. There's countless tropes here in psychology and literature that reappear many, many times. So the dream of the ridiculous man is mainly about a dream that he has. And I would say that the story, even though I think it's divided into 5 different parts, it is a story told in sort of 3 main, I'll write that down here actually, 3 main episodes. There's the episode where he's awake before the dream. There's the episode where he dreams. And there's the episode of the analysis. And it's a really funny thing where if we're kind of categorizing this in terms of how long each part of the story, if we're reading it like the time frame, like how long does each part take you to read, the wakefulness episode, or the part where he's awake and walking around St. Petersburg, meeting a young girl, finding a star in the sky, and contemplating suicide, is a very short part. I'd say it takes roughly a sixth of the story. The dream episode, where he is actively recounting the dream or expressing sort of the idea of the dream, is about 2/6 of the story. And then the rest of it is this whopping 3/6, or about a half of the story, is dedicated to the analysis of the dream, where he talks about, how did it affect him? What did he make of it? How much it matters to him that he was sort of fortunate enough to have that dream, to have that sort of spiritual enlightenment, thinking about life, perspective shift, which is what the whole story is about. And again, thus that's the reason that the story is titled The Dream of the Ridiculous Man. So this short story, very quickly I'll hit on the themes. It's a story about utopias. It's a story about how this one character views the real world in conjunction with a 19th century idea of rediscovered Eden, or restoring an Eden, or an idyllic society, idyllic world, both literally in the sense of a world as a planet with its inhabitants and people and humanity, and as well as a world in the way that he might view it, or Dostoevsky might view it, as like a world that we perceive. And in this case, even though we would cover, utopia, it's a story also about solipsism and about the perspective. If you haven't heard that term before, it's basically the way that we only know what is real through our own perception, through our own perceived reality. Basically, we can't perceive what others could perceive. We can try to have an awareness of that, but we're limited to our own ideas, our own preconceived notions, and our own analysis of what's going on. Has a lot of romantic tropes, which in this case, the idea of Eden is, the pre-fall, or the the world that did not encounter sin yet, is a type of romantic trope. It's a religious story, like I mentioned before, which is also a very interesting romantic trope that deals with the fall into, the descent into hell, the fall from, the biblical fall in this case as well. It's then also talking about this let's say, a modern trope that we might consider in this, 20th century or 21st century perspective, where the idea of Eden, of this new world free of sin, is a little bit like John Lennon's Imagine, or this song that he describes, imagine there's no heaven, or, imagine a world, in peace. And the character of this story really contemplates that idea. He tries to explore it, and then try to understand, how is this real? What is real? What is this idyllic world? And why can't we have it? Why does there have to be suffering tied into love? Why does there have to be happiness tied together with sad? Why can't things, be more united? Why can't there be this idea of like a unity? Which, it's a beautiful idea that I think nowadays when we're thinking about, philosophy of bridging sort of different gaps between, let's say, Eastern, Buddhist, Taoist philosophies and Western Christian, or even sort of like Kierkegaardian ideas of what spiritualism might be considered. It's a very interesting idea where this story by Dostoevsky captures not only what his views would then soon become and how we would perceive him now in the 20th and 21st century, and how he was writing these ideas during that time. It's pretty remarkable. If you wanted to get some further reading, again, I'd recommend a few of these writers. Kierkegaard, I'd recommend Bakhtin, and another Russian philosopher, a literary critic, someone who actually studied Dostoevsky critically. And then romantic literature, English romanticists would be a great way to sort of explore sort of a connection between art and spirituality. Some of my notes here that I'll hit on in my text that I've actually taken notes and highlighted. We have the first part where Dostoevsky's main idea in the story is to know that the truth means to find things meaningless. So this is kind of that precursor to existentialism, and a good way to describe, if you wanted to get into Nietzsche or read Nietzsche a little bit more, this meaninglessness, nihilism, or nihilism as you'd like to say. Solipsism, again, the idea that you can only interpret the world through your own understanding of the world. You're kind of limited to your own experiences and your own analysis. We can compare the story again in two parts, where there's this sort of realistic, dark, and dreary-looking St. Petersburg at night, as opposed to later in the story, this very idyllic world, and then its subsequent fall at the end of the story, or this descent into sort of a hellscape, which is actually sort of a real world where there is war, there is punishment, there is justice, there is honor, which he would, in this case, the character in Dostoevsky's story would consider to be vices, or evidence that human sort of corruption. He uses this word as well. There's this young image of an image of a young girl, a young child in this case. The child approaches this character in the story, and she's actually in physical anguish. You can tell that she's, destitute. She's suffering from poverty. She's cold and wet. And Dostoevsky's character kind of just pushes her away, stamps his foot at her. And in this case, I'd offer some sort of like Marxist critique, or if we're thinking about sort of like the economy at that time, or if we're thinking about how people viewed poverty, or viewed beggars in this case, in this sort of 19th century term. It's very interesting to also offer like maybe a Dickensian analysis to this, if we're thinking about Charles Dickens and his emphasis to focus mainly on the poor and the downtrodden of the 19th century. Dostoevsky sidelines it a little bit, which is quite interesting. It's not the purpose of his story, but it is getting a huge symbolic reference at this point, where I would say that in this passage that the character is confronted by this child who needs his help. he pushes her away. She's at the same time, in these words, whimpering and gasping for breath. The character doesn't really care. He moves on. He's occupied with his own thoughts, and in this way we can sort of view this navel-gazing attitude towards life where people outside of you don't really matter. And this is Dostoevsky's main ideas a lot in his story, where the only thing that really matters is you. And then how you view the world kind of informs your ethics, informs like your morality, what you actually think. He's a very self-absorbed character, as the whole point can see, as the whole story highlights. This might be why he's referred to, and again, this question of why is he a ridiculous man? Is he just way too self-critical? Is he always just thinking way too much? Is he an overthinker? Is he an anxious, paranoid individual? I would say yes, by today's standards. It's a great way to think about the sort of anxiety that this character faced in the 19th century, viewing the world and viewing himself and the relationship between himself and the world, and then how people are just generally in today's world, how they view themselves as well. I thought that it was kind of comical that there was this sort of satirical intent, and I think the whole story is very satirical. I think that's something that Bakhtin refers to as being, there was a word that he uses, Menippean satire, which is this ancient Greek form of satire, which sort of exaggerates emotional anguish, exaggerates the story and the narrative, polarizes things and dramatizes things in order to criticize like intellectual ideas and mental attitudes towards life. In the story, death appears in many forms, in the forms of suicide, in the forms of wishing for his own death to come in a natural form, to be taken by God, to be taken by death is another interesting idea, that we can see that the character isn't really, in a true sense, suicidal. He's more of like an intellectual, he's experiencing this intellectual suicide where he's like, why don't I just die? The world is kind of meaningless. But he's not, he doesn't have enough conviction to actually follow through with committing suicide, which is kind of why he has this dream narrative where he does die. He's sort of taken by God, who is this character, again, God character in the story, that kind of moves the narrative along, but is also a very big theme of this Christian identity that Dostoevsky continuously writes about throughout his whole career. There's a sort of theme of resurrection where Dostoevsky's character dies and is exhumed, or does arise. He's sort of a revenant character, resurrection relating to Christ, but also as an idea of rebirth, to be born again into a pure world, into an Edenic world. There's a lot of aspects when he travels to another planet. It's a very surrealist story. At the time, I believe that surrealism was in its infancy. And it's a beautiful idea to consider Dostoevsky as being a surrealist, even though a huge part, I'd say, if not 99% of his stories are realistic, or, we would call it, realistic fiction, historical, in certain ways, but not necessarily as surrealist as this in certain aspects. I wouldn't really categorize it as being a truly surrealist short story, but absolutely, in comparison to other stories that arrived in the 20th century, this is a great place to sort of look back and see where all of these ideas might have started. The character and his analysis of his own dream is incredibly nuanced, and I highly recommend, if you did read any particular part of the story and you wanted to sort of understand anything, read part 4. This is the part of the story where he analyzes his own dream. Later on in that section, Eden becomes destroyed. He sort of confesses to have corrupted them, and it's not necessarily clear for me, maybe I misread the story, whether or not he corrupted them with his questions or he corrupted them with his own humanity. So it draws into this question of spirituality and Christianity, whether, does it mean that we should be guided, the argument of the story, should we be guided by our moral Christian principles to help us from corrupting ourselves and others? Or is it just an innate part of life that humans corrupt things? The circle appears in the story where we can see there is death and there is this life. Instead of killing himself, he creates a new world through his dream, and through his dream he destroys the world. So, in effect, he kills an entire world, he kills an entire, commits sort of a genocidal act instead of saying, one person to die. And this is that argument that he says, if one person dies, technically I am killing everyone through this solipsistic idea that everyone only exists in my perception of the world, which is a really interesting way in, later on in Nietzsche, later on in existentialism in the 20th century, this idea, even I'm sort of remembering some ideas that Kant explained or had these idea, like that morality is like how everybody believes and everybody acts in what they perceive to be their own moralism. And your own perspectives are kind of the perspectives of everyone. So there's a lot. I don't want to, again, confuse you if you're listening to this and hearing a lot of different philosophers and different philosophical ideas. But it would help if you just quickly YouTube something or opened Wikipedia and checked out 20th century existentialism, nihilism, and Nietzsche. Again, these are huge, deep topics, but they're very good to just get a good sense of what were some thoughts that were being developed and discussed during this decade and half century. At the end, he has a sort of aha moment, a spiritual awakening, or an enlightenment moment, which is exactly the purpose of the end of the story. Dostoevsky wants to offer us a resolution. He does it really great. Again, your taste in the end of the story could differ, and again, because it is spiritual, it has a sort of a cheesy effect for some people. They view it as sort of like a little too happy, but it's a pretty harrowing story if you're thinking about what this character and how the character is describing very visceral emotional responses and experiences to all this to this dream situation that he's describing. So even though it might, again, maybe in this 20th and 21st century perspective, we think about spiritual awakenings or spiritual enlightenment or spiritual explanations to the horrors of life as being sort of a Disney inspired, like everything's okay in the end, life is tough and life is hard and life is, there's war and death and suffering and torture, but things can be explained and we can continue on with life. And that's a nice way to, add Kierkegaard into this mix. It's a nice way to think about, what if some of these philosophers would, like Dostoevsky or Nietzsche, would have lived a little bit longer and seen, the atrocities of World War I and II, if they would see the atrocities of, the genocides across, East Asia, the rise of the Communist Party in Russia, the rise of, fracturing of the African continent, of the colonialism and the independence movements in South and Latin America. It's a huge what if question, and 20th century philosophy does hit back onto these points because they're still so relevant to how we view our world and how we try to justify the horrors, or try to put into a positive perspective. Life is still worth living even after all of the horrible things that happen. So to quickly hit the last point, Dostoevsky's character wakes up. And you can interpret that, again, in sort of a symbolic or a literal sense. And he becomes a preacher, and he sort of evangelizes for the rest of his life. And the last lines, in English at least, of the short story go as, "And I shall go on, I shall go on." And I think, if we're looking for a point, and I don't think that it's I don't think it's facetious at all for Dostoevsky to end the story in such a way. I think he does want us to go on. He does not want us to despair. He does not want the readers or anybody to give up on life, even though I think that the other point, like we saw at the beginning of the story, it is good to question life in the way that he does, to say, life is meaningless. Where do you want to put your meaning into life? How do you want to view your life, and how do you want to justify that, yes, your life is worth living, continue to live, but then live for a purpose. Find that purpose. For him, it's to live abiding by Christian virtues, which is honorable. I think that that's absolutely fine for Dostoevsky, a 19th century Russian gentleman who had faced a lot of his own turmoil to come to an idea like that. And that's my take on The Dream of a Ridiculous Man by Dostoevsky. I highly recommend that you read it. Thanks for checking this out. And I just noticed that the screen cut off, so I'll just put that right there.